novel is a post-Enlightenment form, and traditionally artists, writers tend to be on the more progressive side of history, which means that very few novels actually deal with religion, the church, or God. It might be said, actually, in terms of the English novel, that George Eliot, when she translated Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity, an extraordinary demolition job on Christianity, that she also did a job on the subjects of religion and God and church in the English novel. Now, I happen to have written a novel about these things, and so I was scanning my shelves actually to see what novels are there out there that even from any point of view, whether it's a Christian or an atheist or an agnostic point of view, what novels have tried to look at this subject. Not as a tract or as a piece of kind of evangelical writing, but have taken religion, God, and church as its subject matter. And it's interesting that if I look at my bookshelves, not these because there's a lot of theology in there, but my bookshelves downstairs, of which there are a fair few thousand books, most of them novels, very few have that as the subject. So I thought I'd look at a few today. So yeah, what have we got? So I mean, just for context, I mean, what my novel, As a God Might Be, looks at the nature of faith in the 21st century, at how one might speak about God without defaulting to religious categories. And it also looks about the meaning of the physical presence of the experience of faith in the nature of church building. What might be called the kind of reification of the community of believers, to put it in a somewhat abstruse way. But anyway, so in no particular order, we have The Spire by William Golding, which is an extraordinary short novel. I remember reading in the TLS recently about William Golding was sort of put on this earth to write novels that showed us what really good writing is. Writing that doesn't have a superfluous word or expression. And what's extraordinary about this is that it's so distilled that within the first 20-30 pages we don't really even know what historical period it's set in, because it's so inside the kind of lived world of these people, and the lived world of people. They don't walk around thinking about the historical moment they're in, and this is a sort of my novel actually deals with something sort of similar, the idea of building as folly, and this is obviously a religious building because he's building a church spire, but in terms of just a kind of compactness of prose that almost feels it has the material quiddity of a built thing. Golding's prose does this. It's extraordinary. Then we have Brideshead Revisited, Evelyn Waugh, So the kind of background noise to part of this story is the Roman Catholicism of the Brideshead family, who live at the house. That the I can't remember his name now. The child rider is a kind of interloper into this family, and Catholicism is the background. So in a sense, it's part of the tapestry, but it's not. It's not a sort of central theme until we get to the very end. I'm not going to give anything away. I mean, this is an extraordinarily beautifully written book, a book of such elegance and poise. I'm not a huge War fan because I find him cold, but this is. But what's interesting is he manages to capture, and he became a Roman Catholic. He manages to capture something of the troubling sentimentality of Catholicism in the end, that I find particularly problematic in Catholicism. But he does it very, very well. That people, Catholics, feel very, very emotionally connected to their religion in a way that actually I think is almost more important to them, their emotional connection to it, than actual faith. In fact, the kind of irrational notion of faith. We then have the big 19th century religious or faith-based or God-based novel, Dostoyevsky's Brothers Karamazov, with the two extraordinary chapters, Mutiny and the Grand Inquisitor, where Ivan, who is the middle brother, tries to talk Alyosha down from his faith by using every rational answer or rational argument to demolish God, and then tells the long story of the Grand Inquisitor, which is a moment in sort of in 15th century Spain, what the church decides to do when confronted by the kind of second coming of Jesus, when Jesus suddenly walks amongst us again, that in fact the Catholic Church has to do away with Jesus, because they finally got the world needs, or people need, control and rule following, and essentially Jesus is a radical, a rabble rouser, and the church doesn't want him. And it's an extraordinary book. I mean, it's very long. But what's the most important is that Dostoevsky is known as being very devout, but actually, my philosophy or my reading of Dostoevsky is that he is a true Christian. He is less enamored by the notion of God, or in fact, not even true Christian. He's a true follower of Jesus, and in this book, he pulls apart, I think, the notion of Jesus and God. We then have, talking about Jesus, we then have The Last Temptation by Nikos Kazantzakis. This was then turned into, I think, a bit of a failure of a film, The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese. This is an extraordinarily profound retelling of the Jesus story, going beyond the crucifixion, if you will, in a sense. What is it that happens to Christ, to Jesus, if in fact he avoids the crucifixion? I think this is one of the most profound and moving novels I've ever read, and I think it is a testament to the depth and flexibility and inexhaustibility of the Jesus story, that this novel, which of course was seen as hugely blasphemous and heretical as was the film, that actually it is a deeply engaged and important meditation on the Jesus story, and actually says something new, without, I think, being in any way disrespectful of people who want maybe kind of normative Christianity. Quickly, I talked about Earthly Powers, Burgess, a sort of satire on many things, but it does have an extraordinary character in it, who's Carlo, who starts off as a priest, becomes a Monsignor or something, but then a cardinal, and then becomes Pope. He's essentially a version of the Pope who brought in sort of Vatican II in the late 50s, early 60s. He wants a true universal church. He wants to bring together the Protestant and Catholic movements, but he's also an extraordinary physical and at times thuggish man and there's an extraordinary, very famous scene where he tortures a Nazi, which I have a certain sympathy with. But more than that, Burgess writes an extraordinary alternative opening to Genesis, which doesn't concur with a heteronormative reading of Genesis, and it's brilliant, a tour de force. And there is a sermon about sin, which once again is a tour de force. It's a very serious book, done beautifully satirically. Then we have, I think, my favourite novel ever, Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, one of the most, if not the most poignantly beautiful novel about a father and a son, a aging Congregationalist minister is writing to his young son. He has a son late in life, and he's got a heart condition and he's likely to die, and he's in his 70s, and he has a young son, and he simply writes his life story in some of the most affecting and generous and warm and intelligent prose written ever. I think what's extraordinary about this, and this is often said, you can't make an interesting novel from the voice of a good man, and Reverend Ames is a good man, and it is a near perfect novel. And for anyone interested in the prose form, quality prose, affecting, intelligent, unsentimental but deeply emotional prose, this is the novel. It is a novel as work of art, as moral enterprise, and just breathtaking. And finally, I'm going to do something. I'm going to show you the proof copy of my novel. This is not the cover. This just happens to be the proof cover. Here it is, As a God Might Be. Yes, it is big and it is long. I hope that my novel will at least compete on some level with the novels we talked about. I have no problem saying it is not as good as others, but it's better than some. But I think it has a place, because I think it deals with God, religion, and the church in terms of where we are now, in terms of how do we think about these things when we have radical religion, and I mean Christianity in parts of America, Islam, Zionism. There is that, but then we also have the new atheists and the super rationalists. We are pushed from both sides, and it is very hard to find a place of discourse where we look at our lived experience of the world, and that may not sit comfortably with either of those sides, with fundamentalism or new atheism. And my novel tries to plot a experience of encountering God in silence, and what we do when language breaks down and rationality breaks down, but we feel that there is still more to think and say. Anyway, thank you very much for listening and watching, etc., etc. Yeah, bye bye.